The morning air bit sharply as people hurried down the busy city streets, their breaths forming little clouds in the cold autumn wind. Among them was Linda Park, clutching her coffee cup in one hand while checking her phone with the other. She was running late for another busy day at the law firm where she'd been working for the past 5 years. The usual crowd of office workers streamed past the old brick building, everyone wrapped up warm in their winter coats and scarves. Linda adjusted her own scarf. A beautiful piece of soft cashmere with delicate flowers embroidered along its edges. It wasn't just any scarf, it was her grandmother's last gift to her before passing away. The tiny P stitched in golden thread in one corner reminded her of all the stories her grandmother used to tell about their family history. That's when she saw her. An elderly woman sat huddled in the doorway of an empty shop, her thin jacket pulled tight around her shoulders. Unlike the rushing crowds, she seemed frozen in place, her weather-beaten hands trying to find warmth in her pockets. The woman's face was lined with years of hardship, but her eyes held a gentle kindness that made Linda slow her steps. The old woman wasn't asking for anything, no sign, no cup for coins, just sitting there trying to stay warm. As Linda watched, a particularly harsh gust of wind made the woman pull her jacket even tighter, her shoulders shaking from the cold. Without thinking twice, Linda stopped. Something about the woman reminded her of her own grandmother, who used to say that kindness was like a boomerang. It always came back to you in unexpected ways. Looking at her watch, Linda knew she was already late for her morning meeting, but some things were more important than work schedules. "Excuse me," Linda said softly, approaching the woman. "Would you like my scarf? It's really cold today." The woman looked up, surprise clear in her pale blue eyes. For a moment, she didn't speak, as if trying to decide if the offer was real. "Oh dear, I couldn't possibly," she started to say, her voice rough but gentle. "Please, I insist," Linda said, already unwrapping the scarf from her neck. The cold air immediately nipped at her skin, but she barely noticed. As she carefully placed the scarf around the woman's shoulders, she could feel how the old woman's hands trembled, whether from cold or emotion, she wasn't sure. "I'm Rose," the woman whispered, touching the soft fabric with wonder. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. "Nobody's been this kind to me in, I can't even remember how long." Linda knelt down beside Rose, not caring about her expensive work pants touching the cold concrete. "It looks beautiful on you," she said with a warm smile. "My grandmother always said that good things should be shared." Rose's fingers traced the embroidered flowers, and for a moment she seemed lost in thought. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," she said finally, her voice stronger now. "Thank you, dear. You have no idea what this means to me." As Linda stood up, she felt a warmth in her heart that made the cold morning air seem less bitter. She was about to say goodbye when Rose spoke again, her voice carrying a hint of something Linda couldn't quite place, maybe wisdom, maybe warning. "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything," Rose said, looking directly into Linda's eyes. "Remember that, dear." With a final smile and a quick check of her watch, Linda hurried toward her office building, now properly late for her meeting. As she pushed through the revolving doors, she glanced back one last time at Rose, who was now sitting straighter, the beautiful scarf adding a touch of elegance to her worn clothes. Little did Linda know that this simple gesture, giving away her grandmother's scarf to a stranger, would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others in ways she could never have imagined. The mystery of Rose and the scarf was just beginning, and the story that would unfold would be more incredible than anything Linda could have dreamed up on that cold autumn morning. 3 days after Linda's encounter with Rose, Officer David Kim stood in the middle of Singh's fine jewelry, surrounded by shattered glass cases and a lingering scent of expensive perfume. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the few remaining crystals still clinging to their displays, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the walls. A beautiful contrast to the chaos around him. "What do we know so far?" asked Inspector Raj Patel, walking through the front door with his worn leather notebook already in hand. His weathered face showed the toll of 20 years on the force, but his eyes remained sharp as they scanned the crime scene. "It's a clean job, sir," Officer Kim reported, pointing to the disabled security system. "They knew exactly what they were doing. Happened between 2 and 4 a.m. The alarm never went off," and the cameras went dark for precisely 18 minutes. Inspector Patel nodded, jotting notes while walking carefully around the scattered display cases. Nearly $2 million worth of precious gems had vanished without a trace. This wasn't some smash-and-grab job. It had the hallmarks of professionals. Wait, Inspector Patel stopped suddenly, his eye caught by something under one of the broken cases. What's that? Officer Kim crouched down with a gloved hand and carefully pulled out a scarf. It was beautiful cashmere with intricate flower embroidery along the edges. But what caught their attention wasn't the craftsmanship, it was the small spots of red scattered across one corner. Is that blood? Officer Kim asked, holding the scarf up to the light. Inspector Patel leaned in closer, studying the stains. Get this to the lab right away. And look at this. He pointed to a small golden P embroidered in one corner. This could be our first real lead. As they continued processing the scene, store owner Mr. Singh arrived, his normally cheerful face drawn with worry. My father started this shop 40 years ago, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Nothing like this has ever happened before. While the forensics team worked, Officer Kim reviewed the security footage from nearby buildings. That's when he spotted something interesting, a figure wearing what appeared to be the same scarf, walking past the jewelry store several times in the days leading up to the robbery. Inspector, he called out, rewinding the footage. You need to see this. The grainy video showed someone who looked homeless studying the store's entrance, but there was something odd about their movement, too purposeful, too aware. Freeze it there, Inspector Patel ordered, pointing at the screen. Look at how they're scanning the security cameras. This is no ordinary street person. Back at the police station, the lab results came in faster than usual. Everyone was intrigued by this case. The blood on the scarf was real, but old, probably from a small cut or scrape. More importantly, they found traces of expensive face powder and a long gray hair caught in the fabric. Run everything through the database, Inspector Patel instructed, spreading crime scene photos across his desk. And get me footage from every camera within a 5-block radius. Someone wearing a scarf like this, it stands out. There has to be more. As evening approached, Officer Kim burst into the inspector's office, holding a stack of printouts. Sir, you won't believe this. We found similar security camera patterns at 3 other jewelry stores across the city. Same person, different days, always wearing that scarf. Inspector Patel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The scarf wasn't just evidence, it was a signature, a message perhaps. But from whom? And why leave it behind? Just then, his phone buzzed. The lab had found something else. Tiny traces of breadcrumbs in the scarf's fabric from a specific type of artisanal sourdough sold at only 2 bakeries in the city. Get teams to both those bakeries, he ordered, reaching for his coat. Show them pictures of the scarf. Someone must have seen our mystery person. As they drove through the darkening city streets, Inspector Patel couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something bigger than a simple jewelry heist. The scarf, the careful planning, the deliberate clues, it felt like the opening move in a larger game. Little did they know that miles away, in a quiet corner of the city, Linda Park was just getting home from work, completely unaware that her simple act of kindness had become the center of a growing police investigation. The evening news would soon be filled with stories of the heist, but for now, she was still thinking about Rose and hoping the scarf was keeping her warm on another cold night. The morning bustle of the police station felt different today. Inspector Patel sat at his desk, surrounded by security camera printouts, witness statements, and a single photograph of the embroidered scarf that had become the center of their investigation. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as he pieced together a timeline of events. A knock on his office door broke his concentration. Officer Kim entered, holding a tablet. Sir, we found something in the building security footage from last week. You need to see this. The video showed a well-dressed woman stopping to talk to someone sitting in a doorway. The timestamp read 8:47 a.m., just 3 days before the robbery. As they watched, the woman removed her scarf, the same distinctive scarf from the crime scene, and gave it to what appeared to be an elderly homeless person. Can we enhance the footage? Inspector Patel asked, leaning closer to the screen. Already did. Officer Kim swiped to a clearer image. The woman works in the Carter building. Her name is Linda Park, corporate lawyer, been with the same firm for 5 years. Clean record, not even a parking ticket. Inspector Patel studied the image thoughtfully. Bring her in. But quietly, no uniforms. We don't want to spook our real target. An hour later, Linda sat in the interview room, looking confused and slightly nervous. The room wasn't like the harsh interrogation rooms you see in movies. The department had recently renovated it to feel more welcoming, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. Still, being called to the police station had clearly rattled her. Ms. Park, Inspector Patel began gently. Thank you for coming in. We're hoping you can help us with something. He placed a photo of the scarf on the table between them. Linda's eyes widened in recognition. That's my grandmother's scarf. Did something happen to Rose? Is she okay? The genuine concern in her voice was unmistakable. Rose? Officer Kim asked, making a note. The one I gave the scarf to, Linda explained, worry creasing her forehead. She was cold, and it just felt like the right thing to do. My grandmother always taught me to help others when I could. She paused, looking between the two officers. Did something happen? Inspector Patel shared a look with Officer Kim before continuing. This scarf was found at the scene of a jewelry store robbery. 2 million in gems were taken. He watched Linda's face carefully as he spoke. The color drained from Linda's face. What? No, that's impossible. Rose was just, she seemed so. Her voice trailed off as she tried to process the information. Tell us everything you remember about Rose, Inspector Patel encouraged. Every detail could be important. As Linda described her encounter, Officer Kim sketched rapidly on his notepad. The gentle eyes, the weathered hands, the way Rose had touched the scarf with such reverence. Details that seemed insignificant at the time now took on new meaning. There was something she said, Linda remembered suddenly, when I was leaving. She told me that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. The way she said it, it felt important somehow. Inspector Patel nodded thoughtfully. Did she mention where she usually stays? Any specific places she visits? Linda shook her head. No, I'm sorry. I wish I'd talked to her more now. I just wanted to help her stay warm. As they wrapped up the interview, Inspector Patel assured Linda she wasn't in any trouble. Your kindness isn't a crime, Ms. Park, but it might help us understand something much bigger. Back at his desk, Inspector Patel pinned a new photo to his board, the security camera image of Rose wearing the scarf. Something about her posture, the way she carried herself even while sitting on the street, nudged at his memory. Run facial recognition, he told Officer Kim. But not just recent databases. Go back, way back. Focus on cases from the 1980s. As the sun set over the city, Linda walked home, her mind spinning with questions. The same streets she walked every day now felt different, filled with secrets and mysteries. She found herself scanning faces in the crowd, wondering about Rose, hoping she was okay despite everything. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, an elderly woman watched the evening news report about the jewelry heist. She smiled slightly, running her fingers over a newspaper clipping from 40 years ago, a headline about another unsolved robbery. The TV droned on about the investigation, but she wasn't really listening. Her mind was on Linda and the unexpected kindness that had touched something long forgotten in her heart. The scarf lay folded neatly on a table nearby, its embroidered flowers catching the last rays of sunlight. It was more than evidence now. It had become a bridge between two worlds, connecting past and present in ways no one could have predicted. And somewhere in the city's shadows, an old story was beginning to resurface, brought to light by a simple act of kindness on a cold morning. Officer Kim rushed into Inspector Patel's office, holding a stack of old case files. The excitement in his eyes told the inspector this was something big. Sir, the facial recognition results are in. You're not going to believe this. He spread several yellowed newspaper clippings across the desk. They showed a striking woman in her 30s, elegant and poised, being led into a courthouse. The headline read, "The Ghost Thief Finally Caught. Mysterious Rose Wilson Stands Trial." Inspector Patel leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. Rose Wilson, why does that name sound familiar? Because, Officer Kim said, pulling out more files, she was legendary. They called her the Ghost because she could slip in and out of anywhere without leaving a trace. High-end jewelry stores were her specialty. But here's the thing, she never hurt anyone, never carried weapons. Some people even called her a modern-day Robin Hood because expensive items would disappear from the rich and anonymous donations would show up at orphanages and homeless shelters. The inspector studied the old photographs, comparing them to their security camera footage. The elegant young woman and the homeless elderly person seemed worlds apart, yet there was something in the eyes, a sparkle of intelligence that time couldn't dim. According to the records, Officer Kim continued, she disappeared 30 years ago. Everyone thought she had died in a boating accident off the coast. Body was never found. Inspector Patel stood up and walked to his evidence board. So instead of dying, she just vanished, became invisible by being someone everyone ignores. He shook his head in admiration. It's brilliant, really. Just then, his phone rang. It was the lad with results from the bakery surveillance. Sir, we found her routine. She buys a loaf of sourdough every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 a.m. from the Bay Street Bakery. She's there like clockwork. The next morning, Inspector Patel sat in the bakery, pretending to read a newspaper. The aroma of fresh bread filled the air as early customers trickled in. At exactly 7 a.m., she appeared, Rose Wilson, the ghost thief, now just another elderly woman picking up her morning bread. He watched as she chatted with the young baker, asking about his family with genuine interest. She paid with exact change and even shared a piece of her bread with a stray cat outside. Nothing about her suggested a master thief who had just pulled off a $2 million heist. As she turned to leave, Inspector Patel approached her. The sourdough here is excellent, isn't it, Ms. Wilson? Or do you prefer being called the ghost? Rose didn't seem surprised. She looked at him with those intelligent eyes and smiled softly. I was wondering how long it would take. Would you like to share some bread, Inspector? I find conversations go better with fresh bread. They sat on a nearby park bench, feeding pigeons. You know why I'm here, he said. The jewelry store, she nodded. Quite a mess they made. Not my style at all, really. I always prided myself on clean jobs, no broken glass, no violence, no mess. But the scarf? Your signature? Rose's face softened. Linda's scarf, that was unexpected. Such a simple act of kindness. Reminded me of someone I used to be long ago. She turned to face the inspector. You've read my old files. Did you ever wonder why I never kept anything I took? Inspector Patel had wondered about that. Every stolen piece had eventually found its way to charity auctions or anonymous donations. You were making a point. I was trying to wake people up, she said, breaking off another piece of bread. Show them that all their precious things, their wealth, their status, it could disappear in an instant. But kindness, that stays, that changes things. The inspector studied her face. The jewelry store owner, Mr. Singh. His father testified against you in '82. Good memory, Rose smiled. But I didn't rob his store. I've been watching, though. Someone's been using my old methods, making it look like I'm back. Someone who knows my history. A chill ran down Inspector Patel's spine. You're being framed. Not exactly, Rose said, standing up slowly. I'm being honored. You see, Inspector, over the years I may have taught a few people. Young ones living on the streets like I pretended to be. Showed them there were better ways than violence. Some of them took those lessons to heart. She handed him a folded piece of paper. Here's a list of names, my students, you might say. One of them is behind the recent robbery. But be gentle with them, Inspector. Sometimes people just need a chance to change, like Linda's kindness reminded me. As Rose walked away, Inspector Patel looked at the list in his hands. The piece of the puzzle he'd been missing wasn't about the robbery at all. It was about legacy, about how one person's actions could ripple through time in unexpected ways. Back at the station, he pinned a new note to his evidence board. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. Rose's words to Linda now seemed less like a warning and more like a lesson, one that had taken 30 years to teach. Inspector Patel spread Rose's list of names across his desk, each one connected to a different unsolved case over the past 5 years. The web of connections was growing more complex by the hour. His small office had become a maze of photos, sticky notes, and red strings connecting seemingly unrelated events. Look at this pattern, Officer Kim said, pointing to a map on the wall. Every robbery happened within 2 blocks of a homeless shelter. We thought it was just coincidence. Because nobody looks twice at homeless people, Inspector Patel finished, remembering Rose's words. They become invisible. Just then, Linda Park knocked on the office door, looking worried. I remembered something else about Rose, she said, clutching her purse. I saw her talking to a group of young people behind a shelter last week. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but they weren't asking for money or food. They were studying something. The inspector leaned forward. Can you describe these young people? 3 of them, Linda said, closing her eyes to remember. 2 looked like college students, backpacks, laptops. The 3rd was older, maybe 30, wearing a security guard uniform. Officer Kim quickly pulled up employee records from the jewelry store. Sir, one of their night guards quit 2 days before the robbery. Started working there 6 months ago. The pieces were starting to fit together. Inspector Patel turned to his computer and pulled up surveillance footage from other jewelry stores in the city. In each one, the same security guard appeared, working different shifts under slightly different names. He wasn't just planning one robbery, the inspector muttered. He was mapping out the whole system. Linda looked at the photos on the wall, her eyes landing on an old newspaper clipping about Rose. I don't understand. Why would she help them? She seemed so genuine when I gave her the scarf. Because she was genuine, Inspector Patel said softly. Rose Wilson spent 30 years living on the streets, not just hiding, but watching, seeing how people treated the homeless, how the gap between rich and poor kept growing. She was building something, a network of people she thought she could trust to carry on her work. Just then, Officer Kim burst back in. Sir, we found a connection to the Singh family. The security guard? He's the grandson of someone who lost everything after testifying in Rose's trial. His family never recovered. The inspector sat back, understanding dawning on his face. It's not just about the money. It's about settling old scores, continuing a legacy. As they talked, a young officer rushed in with new security footage. The same group Linda had described was spotted entering an old warehouse by the river. But something was different this time. They were carrying equipment, lots of it. They're planning another job, Inspector Patel realized. Something bigger. Linda stood up, determination in her eyes. Let me help. Rose trusted me once. Maybe she'll listen again. The inspector shook his head. It's too dangerous. These aren't just thieves. They're people with decades of grudges and nothing to lose. Exactly, Linda insisted. But they're also people Rose chose to teach. She saw something in them worth saving, just like she saw something that day when I offered her my scarf. Sometimes people just need to be seen, to be treated like they matter. As they debated, more reports came in. Other precincts were finding similar patterns. Sophisticated robberies, always near homeless shelters, always with inside help. Rose hadn't just trained a few people, she'd created an underground network of modern-day Robin Hoods. Inspector Patel studied the evidence wall one more time. Among all the photos and clips, Linda's scarf stood out, a simple piece of fabric that had unknowingly connected them all. Its delicate embroidery seemed to mock them, each flower hiding another secret, another layer of the mystery. The warehouse, he said finally. That's where it all comes together. But we need to be smart about this. Rose spent 30 years building this network. If we go in too hard, we'll just drive them deeper underground. Linda picked up the scarf from the evidence table, running her fingers over the familiar pattern. You know, she said thoughtfully, my grandmother used to say that a gift given with kindness creates a bond that's hard to break. Maybe that's what Rose was counting on all along. The inspector looked at her curiously. What do you mean? She kept the scarf, wore it openly, left it at the scene. She wanted to be found, but not by the police, by someone who had shown her kindness. She's trying to tell us something. As evening fell over the city, Inspector Patel made a decision. Sometimes solving a case wasn't about catching criminals. It was about understanding why good people make desperate choices. And sometimes the biggest revelations come wrapped in the simplest packages, like a scarf given freely on a cold morning. The old warehouse loomed against the darkening sky, its broken windows reflecting the last rays of sunset. Inspector Patel sat in his unmarked car, watching as Linda nervously adjusted her coat. They had agreed she would approach first, wearing the scarf they had carefully retrieved from evidence. Remember, he said softly, if anything feels wrong, just walk away. We have teams covering every exit. Linda nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the familiar embroidered flowers on the scarf. I'll be fine. Rose isn't dangerous. She just wants to be heard. Through his earpiece, Inspector Patel could hear Officer Kim confirming positions around the warehouse. They had spotted at least 6 people inside, moving equipment and checking computers. The security guard, now identified as Tommy Chen, grandson of the man who had testified against Rose, was directing everything. Linda walked toward the warehouse's side door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet evening. Before she could knock, the door opened. Rose stood there, looking somehow more dignified than she had on the street, despite wearing the same worn clothes. I knew you'd come, Rose said warmly. The scarf brought you back, just like I hoped it would. She gestured for Linda to enter. Don't worry about your police friends outside. They're welcome to join us. This was always meant to be a conversation, not a confrontation. Inside, the warehouse was surprisingly well organized. Computer screens showed security feeds from various jewelry stores across the city. Maps and blueprints covered one wall, while display cases held what looked like sophisticated electronic equipment. Tommy Chen stepped forward, his security guard uniform replaced by casual clothes. His face was young, but his eyes were old, carrying the weight of his family's struggles. Everything's ready, he told Rose, just like you taught us. Rose nodded, then turned to Linda. You must have questions. About why I kept your scarf, why I left it at the jewelry store. I do, Linda admitted, and so does Inspector Patel. She looked toward the door meaningfully. Rose smiled. Inspector? You can come in now. Your team too. Though I'd appreciate it if they left their weapons outside. We have much to discuss. Inspector Patel entered cautiously, followed by Officer Kim and 2 other detectives. The warehouse's inner lights flickered on, revealing more of Rose's students, young people from the streets, each with their own story of loss and redemption. This isn't just about robbery, Rose began, gesturing to the equipment around them. This is about justice, about balance. Every piece we've taken has been documented, every dollar tracked. We're not thieves, we're whistleblowers. She walked to one of the computers and pulled up financial records. These jewelry stores, these wealthy businesses, they've been avoiding taxes, exploiting workers, destroying small competitors. We didn't just take their jewels, we took their data, their secrets. Tommy stepped forward. My grandfather lost everything trying to tell the truth about corruption in the jewelry industry. Rose showed us how to finish what he started. Inspector Patel studied the evidence on the screens. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, forged certificates, a web of corporate crime far bigger than a few stolen necklaces. Why now? He asked. After 30 years of hiding. Rose touched the scarf around Linda's shoulders. Because of this, one simple act of kindness from a stranger made me realize we were doing it wrong. Hiding in the shadows, letting bitterness drive us, it wasn't changing anything. But Linda showed me that real change starts with trust, with being seen. She turned to her students. We're not running anymore. Everything we've gathered, all the evidence, all the stolen items, it's yours, Inspector. But on one condition, the truth comes out. All of it. About the corruption, the tax fraud, everything. Linda looked around at the young faces, seeing not criminals but people fighting for something they believed in. The scarf, she said suddenly. You left it at the jewelry store because you wanted to be found. You wanted to connect your past to your present. Rose smiled. Smart girl. Every good story needs a thread that ties it all together. Your kindness was that thread. Inspector Patel took in the scene. The sophisticated operation, the dedicated young people, the evidence of corporate crimes that dwarfed the jewelry heists. This wasn't the confrontation he had expected. It won't be simple, he said finally. But if everything you're showing us is true, we can work together. Make it right the legal way. As they talked into the night, working out details and sharing stories, Linda watched Rose with her students. The homeless woman who had touched her heart that cold morning was still there, but now she saw more. A teacher, a protector, someone who had spent 30 years preparing for this moment of truth. The scarf that had started it all now lay across a table, its embroidered flowers witnessing the beginning of something new, not an ending to a crime spree, but the start of a different kind of justice. The morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as Linda adjusted her grandmother's scarf. the same one that had started this whole journey 3 months ago. The courtroom was packed with reporters, all eager to witness the conclusion of what the papers had dubbed the ghost's final case. Rose sat at the witness stand, her silver hair neatly combed, wearing a simple but dignified blue dress instead of her usual street clothes. She looked different now, more like the elegant woman from those old newspaper photos, but her eyes still held that same gentle wisdom that had touched Linda's heart on that cold morning. "Ms. Wilson," the district attorney began, "please tell the court about the evidence you and your students gathered." Rose spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. She explained how they had uncovered years of tax fraud, worker exploitation, and money laundering across multiple jewelry stores and their parent companies. The stolen jewels had been just a small part of a much bigger story. In the gallery, Tommy Chen sat with the other young people Rose had mentored. They had all been granted immunity in exchange for their testimony and the return of the stolen items. More importantly, they had been offered jobs with corporate watchdog organizations, using their skills to fight corruption legally. Inspector Patel watched from his seat near the back, remembering the night in the warehouse when everything had changed. The case had grown far beyond a simple jewelry heist, leading to the arrest of several corporate executives and the recovery of millions in unpaid taxes. During the lunch break, Linda found Rose in the courthouse garden, feeding pigeons just like she used to do on the streets. "I never thought my old scarf would help uncover all this," Linda said, sitting beside her. Rose smiled, breaking off a piece of bread. "Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest differences. Your kindness that morning, it wasn't just about keeping me warm. It reminded me that change doesn't always have to come from fighting. Sometimes it comes from connecting, from being seen as human." Back in the courtroom, the evidence mounted. Financial records, secret recordings, insider testimonies, all painting a picture of corporate greed that had destroyed families like Tommy's. Rose's network hadn't just been stealing jewels, they had been gathering proof, building a case that could no longer be ignored. When the verdicts were finally read, justice took an unexpected turn. The corporate executives faced serious prison time, while Rose and her students were acknowledged for exposing the corruption. The judge, impressed by their commitment to justice despite their unorthodox methods, worked with the prosecution to create a unique resolution. In light of the extraordinary circumstances, the judge announced, "Ms. Wilson will serve as a consultant to our new corporate crime task force, using her expertise to train investigators in detecting financial fraud. Her students will be enrolled in a special program, combining their technology skills with legal education." Inspector Patel couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the law needed to bend a little to truly serve justice. The stolen jewels were returned, the corrupt executives were held accountable, and Rose's 30-year mission had finally found its true purpose. After the trial, Linda and Rose stood on the courthouse steps, watching as reporters interviewed Tommy and the other young people about their new roles in fighting corporate crime. "What will you do now?" Linda asked, touching the scarf that had brought them together. Rose looked at the city skyline, her eyes bright with purpose. "Keep teaching, but differently now. Help these young people use their skills to make real change. Maybe start a foundation to help others who've lost their way find a better path." Linda suddenly remembered something. "You knew, didn't you? When I gave you the scarf? You knew it would lead to all this." "No," Rose laughed softly. "I just knew that real kindness, given freely, has a way of changing things. Your scarf reminded me that even after 30 years of hiding, of fighting from the shadows, sometimes the best way to make change is to let yourself be seen, to trust in the goodness of others." 6 months later, the old warehouse had been transformed into the Wilson Center for Corporate Accountability, where Rose and her former students worked alongside legal experts and reformed executives to prevent corporate fraud. Linda's scarf hung framed in the entrance hall, its embroidered flowers a reminder of how a simple act of kindness had uncovered truth and justice. Inspector Patel still visited sometimes, bringing coffee and fresh bread. He would find Rose in her office, usually surrounded by young interns eager to learn from her lifetime of experience. The ghost thief had finally found her true calling, not in taking things away, but in giving back, in teaching others how to fight for justice the right way. And on cold mornings, when Linda walked past people in need, she always carried an extra scarf. because now she knew that every small gesture of kindness could be the beginning of something much bigger, a story of change, of justice, and of the unexpected ways that people could help each other find their way back to the light.